Thank you very much. Thank you kindly for coming out tonight to share the evening with us. Thanks to Avant for putting this event on. I've got to say, when Avant first contacted me, I didn't get the phone call. It went through to voicemail, and so all I got was a voicemail telling me to urgently contact a senior member of Avant. And so naturally, I was absolutely panicked, and then quite relieved when I found out it was for this. And then the next wave of panic came when I started to put the slides together and thinking, are they still going to insure me after I present tonight? But I'm lucky enough to be mates with Richard Harris, who was one of the leads in the Thai cave rescue, and he's done these talks before. I had a chat with him. He assured me that they still insure him after he drugged up a bunch of Thai kids in a flooded cave. So hopefully you'll still insure me after tonight. So look, what I'd like to talk to tonight, as Michael briefly spoke to just now, is some of my experiences as a doctor with Army Special Operations, and particularly deployed in environments like Afghanistan. Talk through a few case studies of some of the trauma that we dealt with over there and some of the war wounds. And then from there, I just want to move on to my personal experience when I discharged from the military. And it was at that point that I really started to have a few sort of wobbles with my mental health, if you like. I went through a bad patch, and that led me to looking at why I was able to, and not just me, the whole bunch of us within Special Operations, remain so resilient within that environment where we were constantly on high operational tempo and experiencing a whole bunch of cumulative stress and trauma. And it was when we disconnected from that group that people seemed to have a bit of a wobble. And so that led to this real deep dive into resilience that then led to a book project called The Resilient Shield that I'll talk more to, but just looking at resilience on a granular level. And I think it's very relevant to everyone in the room, because it doesn't matter if your trauma and stress is a military environment like mine used to be, or any facet of medicine. It's a very, very stressful job, and if you don't have techniques to manage that stress, or if you're not even identifying those stressors and don't have techniques to manage it and build your resilience, then the burnout rates in medicine are huge. And so I think everyone in the room this relates to. There are graphic images in here. It's hard to do a talk around war trauma without doing that, but I figured everyone here has probably seen some of this sort of stuff before. So as a bio, so this was me back when I used to cut my own hair. I pay for my haircuts now, so $30 this one. But I did a Bachelor of Exercise Science when I got out of school. I did that part-time over about 5 years because I was trying to make it as a professional triathlete. That when I was about 23, I realised I wasn't going to be the athlete that I wanted to be. And my dad had been in the Army, my brother had gone into the Army, so it was kind of the family business. So I started looking towards the Army, and I also sat GAMSAT and got through, and those two things came together with an Army scholarship to study medicine. So I went off to med school on an Army scholarship. I was hell-bent on joining the Special Air Service Regiment from very early in my medical schooling. My brother had gone through as an Army officer, and he'd done SAS selection, gone into the Special Air Service. I'd seen what that looked like and wanted to do it. So the first second I had the opportunity, which was in 2008, I went and did the SAS selection course, and I was successful on that course and then moved into Special Operations from there. I'm a GP by trade, finished up my GP ticket in 2010. So when that photo was taken, I was a GP. I don't think I'd see that GP. I'd probably wait a couple of hours to see the other guy, but I was a GP nonetheless at that stage. Worked with Special Operations between 2009 and 2014. It was a very busy time for Australian Army across the board, and particularly Special Operations. We were away a lot on combat operations in places like Afghanistan, Iraq. I spent cumulatively about 2 years in Afghanistan over that period. When we were home, we'd fall into counter-terrorist duties and a thing called SRO, Special Recovery Operations, which is hostage rescue type stuff. And so it was sort of, we were either away or we were home, but it was all relatively high intensity, very interesting and rewarding work, but very, very busy. When I got out of the Army, I did an MBA, which I finished up in 2016, and I've held some medical director roles since. So I was a deputy med director up at a little hospital in Queensland at a place called Yeppoon. I've just come out of 3.5 years as the med director for the South Australian Prison Health Service, finished that up in April this year. I've worked with Home Affairs on their independent medical advisory panel. I've done some higher studies in medical administration with an associate fellowship there. I instruct on EMST. co-founder of this company called Resilient Shield, and I'll talk more to the book as we go along. And this is probably my greatest achievement. I'm still married through all of that, and I've got 3 boys. So this is my wife's greatest achievement. She's put up with me through all of that. So I thought yes, thank you, yeah. Actually, I used to, I used to joke about they should give the medals to the wives of military members because they're the ones that really earn them. That's a hard job at home. Just wanted to talk to a case study from Afghanistan. So just basically a day at the office, if you like, from my old role. And so at this point, almost to the day 10 years ago, I was detached to the US Drug Enforcement Administration, and we were doing counter-narcotic operations in southern Afghanistan. So we were hitting the world's heroin trade at its source, and Afghanistan grows a lot of the opium poppies. And so we were out hitting targets surrounding the heroin trade. And so we had 2 targets on that day. These images are taken from the first target. We'd inserted by helicopter, had a brief gunfight, and then the enemy dispersed and set up around the village to attack us on withdrawal. On the right-hand slide there, those bags, that tarry black stuff is raw opium. That's what they scratch the opium poppies, and the sap that leaks out, they collect that and then process it into heroin. And also on that target was a bunch of rocket-propelled grenades and AK-47s. The little round things are anti-personnel mines that they'd used to detonate their improvised explosive devices. And so it was a really good day of targeting. As we went to extract from this target, the helmet camera footage that you'll see in a second is my helmet camera when we went to extract. And what ended up happening was our helicopter overflew where it was meant to land, landed out in the open, and one of our guys gets shot as we're trying to extract there. And so it just shows a brief snippet of just the complexity of the environment within which we were working medically, trying to assess and manage casualties. And the other part of the context is we had a second target to go to about 10 minutes time of flight, so we only had this really brief stint in the helicopter. And so this was how it all played out. The assessment was there was about 20 enemy fighters in a cemetery about 100 metres up the hill from the helicopter, and so they were desperately trying to shoot that thing out of the sky. The guy who gets shot is the one kneeling on the far right there. And so while that's happening, he's being hit just next to me, and they're dragging him into the helicopter when I turn around, so they're loading him in there. At that point, the helicopter's taken off, and that's our door gunner engaging the enemy. So fortunately he was doing okay, chewing gum, putting his thumbs up, hard as nails, that guy. My main concern at that point, I hadn't seen any exit wound, was that the bullet was up in his belly somewhere. But I'd assessed that he was probably okay, and so we decided to insert on the second target, left him on the helicopter, and he went off and got surgery that afternoon. And so this was the second target, which was about 20 kilos of processed heroin. That's what I'm holding in my left hand there, and a whole bunch of Taliban drug money. And so we went into that village, similar sort of thing, bit of a gunfight, and then the enemy cleared out, and we cleared the village and just made a big bonfire and burned all the heroin and money. And then about an hour after that photo was taken, we had another casualty. So this bloke here, a bloke by the name of Ryan Robinson, unfortunately was shot in the neck, and I found myself on another helicopter trying to race him back to a surgical facility, but we couldn't save Rowan on that day, and he passed away. And so this was the environment that we were working in, and this was not an altogether unusual day at the office, to be honest. It was pretty normal for our element to be doing these kind of operations, to be trying to provide medical care within that construct of special operations. And so it was a very unique and really privileged role, but what we needed to be able to do from a medical perspective is basically do most of the functions of an SAS operator to be able to project forward and be able to use our medical skill set. And so we used to talk about what we'd call the platinum 10. So we hear about the golden hour. We pulled that right back to 10 minutes, and some of the case studies you'll see why in a minute. If we weren't responding to some of the wounding profiles that we were seeing on the battlefield within minutes, you'd lose that person. So there's just a couple of snapshots. The one on the top left, that guy had actually had a rocket-propelled grenade hit his shin and shatter his tibia, and so you'd drag them into the nearest compound, and I gave the wound a bit of a clean-up, a few antibiotics, a bit of morphine, and pop him on a helicopter. So pretty dynamic sort of environment. The part of the training meant we needed to be able to insert and extract and move around like any other special operator. So there was a lot of work out of helicopters. That's a thing called a suspended extraction. If you needed to get out of somewhere in a hurry, the helicopter would come in, kick out a caving ladder, you'd clip onto it, and the helicopter would bug out, which was a lot of fun. But lots of fast roping, lots of parachuting, working in ships, submarines, all sorts of things, and then training in all the weapon systems as well. So that gun there's a thing called an M4, just a pretty standard assault rifle that we'd use, but there was a whole range of weapons training and skills maintenance there, and all the vehicles as well. So you got this amazing for across the board training in all these insertion, extraction and warfighting techniques, which allowed us to project forward and be there to provide our medical support. It was a very physical role, so these photos are taken from actually the SAS selection course that I did, which is a 3-week course and a great test of resilience. And if you get yourself through that just gets a foot in the door to do further training with the SAS regiment, so you don't actually get qualified for about another year after selection. But there was a big emphasis on physical fitness. It was part of the role. We had 2 hours of every working day dedicated to PT, so you'd get this great ability to maintain your fitness. It wasn't uncommon for us to carry loads of 40 or 50 kilos. In that video you saw before, I had about 55 kilos on my back, and some operations you'd have to push that out to 85, 90 kilos if we were going to be without resupply. So there was a big emphasis on physical fitness as part of the role. And then a lot of the time this was doing what was called ship underway recovery, so trying to take back a ship that had been taken hostage. This is just a training exercise, but a lot of the time the complexity of the job wasn't so much the medicine, it was the environment within which you had to operate. And this is a decent case study. We had a bloke on a surveillance boat, a little dive boat that the unit used to use, and we got the call that he had a resting heart rate of 140, and every time he tried to stand up he fell over, and so we had to get out to this boat. But the complexity there was it needed to keep moving. It had a target it had to get to, it couldn't stop, and so the only way we could get this guy off was to have a moving helicopter. We winched in, myself and a replacement for this SAS operator, and then winched him off. And it turned out that he'd popped a stomach ulcer. So as all good SAS operators do, he'd been chewing naproxen thousands every day for years and eventually popped this ulcer. And he'd had melena for about 4 days, it turns out, which was very popular on a small dive boat like that. The crew loved him, and he had a hemoglobin of about 55. And so this was us winching him out and taking him off and replacing him. So these were the sort of complexities. Lots of hearts and minds type stuff, and so there's all the warfighting side of things, but a huge use of the medical elements within special operations was the hearts and minds, and that was particularly relevant in counterinsurgency operations, where it's crucial to get the local population on board to try and turn them against organisations like Al-Qaeda or the Taliban in Afghanistan. So this was a really rewarding part of the job where we could go and do all of this. And I mean, these are taken up in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, and it's simple stuff, scrubbing impetigo or stitching up a machete wound. But I mean, there's not a lot of medical resource in the highlands of Papua New Guinea and Afghanistan, so you can really make a big difference with minimal medical interventions, but it was something I found hugely rewarding. This little guy got brought to me with a bleeding ear and was very distressed. His dad was very distressed, and so we dragged him into a little compound where it was safe. I distracted him with a cucumber. So any paediatricians or GPs in the room, that's a great trick. Might not work as well in Australia as it does in Afghanistan, but was able to pull quite a large larvae out of his ear and sort him out. So I mean, simple sort of stuff, not high-level medicine, but can make a huge difference to these populations that don't have much. This was a guy who'd been captured and tortured by the Taliban and cut up quite badly. And once again, we were out on a job. We'd done our job and it was relatively safe, so I had the opportunity to stitch him up, fill him full of some intravenous antibiotics and sort of help his day. Sort of little girl who was just very, very sick next to, I thought she was dead actually when they first brought her out. We'd done a vehicle-mounted operation and on our way back to base, we'd bogged one of our vehicles in a river, and as we were extracting it, the local villagers brought this young girl out, and she was lifeless, sunken eyes, and she had just had dysentery. So the infant mortality rate in Afghanistan is huge, and she had just had gastro for days and days and days and was just horribly dehydrated, and so we put an intraosseous into her and gave her a fluid bolus until we could get a drip in, and then gave her some intravenous fluids and antibiotics and pepped her up a little bit. But while we were doing that, the village elders all sort of came around, saw what we were doing to help this young girl, and through our interpreters told us that there was a massive improvised explosive device that the Taliban had planted in the road just up the way, and so we were able to find that and defuse it. And otherwise we would have almost certainly hit it. And so these were the sort of really rewarding uses of a medical asset within special operations in a counterinsurgency type space that really made the job good. And of course, unfortunately, we saw the war wounds, and so this was something we saw all too often. And so this is a dismounted improvised explosive device strike, so someone standing on an IED, and that was the patterns of injuries that we'd see, these horrendous lower limb injuries. Now, the key thing for us in this context, and you'll appreciate that person has only got minutes to live if you don't stop that arterial blood flow. And so what you see in all of those photos there is arterial tourniquets, and that was something that you really needed to be there within minutes to provide. And all our operators were trained to use arterial tourniquets. They all carried them, and this is what was saving lives day in, day out in Afghanistan. It was a real sort of simple medicine, but once again life-saving if you can get that intervention in a timely fashion. We'd carry blood for transfusion on most of our missions, and so pre-hospital we were able to tourniquet, we could transfuse them up. We'd carry TXA, and so you could put some TXA antibiotics if it was appropriate. Used a lot of ketamine for pain relief, but also for its dissociative purposes. So we had a decent capability. We'd have oxygen that you could provide in the field, and then the aeromedical evacuation helicopters would come and get them. These are taken at what's called forward surgical teams, which were these really rudimentary surgical elements that were positioned around the place in Afghanistan and Iraq. Used a lot of intraosseous, as I mentioned with that little girl. This was a couple of IED blast victims that were quite deeply shocked by the time we got to them. And it's to put medicines in to make him feel better. So that's just lots of work through interpreters. He was a local national police officer, this guy. And it might hurt a little bit at first. And so a lot of the time we'd go straight to IO, and in this setting someone had tried to put a drip in him, but it was failing and he was quite shut down. He had a really thready radial pulse, and so it was just much easier to use IO. Also in settings where it was low light or there was a tactical situation in helicopters, vehicles, these kind of things where it's very difficult to try and cannulate someone, particularly when they're shocked, we'd often go straight to IO. Likewise with airway algorithms. So this was a IED strike. This bloke was in a car, but lots and lots of burns from IED explosions, and this guy had some obviously quite bad facial burns, and as we all know, you get a lot of swelling with facial burns, so that was him about half an hour after the first image was taken, just with that swelling, particularly when you start to fluid resuscitate them. And so there was a very low threshold to put in surgical airways, and basically our airway algorithm often went from a nasopharyngeal to a surgical airway with nothing in between. So it was quite sort of proactive and very low threshold for securing those airways surgically. There's no ramping in Afghanistan, so cars just pull up and they pile out into these forward surgical teams. This is, once again, a local national IED strike and people just getting piled into these FSTs. And when we weren't out on operations, we were able to go and do shifts on the forward aeromedical evacuation helicopter. So we'd go out on the AME bird and pick people up from the field and manage them in flight, or we'd go down to these surgical teams and help out there. So even when we weren't on operations, we'd still be engaging in what was, with hindsight, a whole bunch of cumulative trauma. And so this is one of the resus beds in the FST in Tarankot, which was where our SAS element, our Special Operations element, was based. And it was one of the busiest ones in Afghanistan, so there was this constant flow of high-velocity gunshot wounds and IED injuries. This is a lady that just got shot through the chest, caught up in a gunfight. We'd then be able to, after we resuscitated them, head out to the back where there was a couple of little, once again, very rudimentary surgical beds, and the anaesthetists there were very happy for us to get involved with the anaesthetics. So there was some brilliant experience from an anaesthetic perspective, supervised by the American anaesthetists there. This is an interesting case study. So this was an Afghan military member who'd come to us deeply shocked. We didn't get the full story, but he had gunshot wounds through his thighs. He had strong peripheral pulses, there was nothing arterial, and then he had this strange gunshot wound, this injury to his right hip area there. And we, anyway, did a usual shock workup. He didn't respond to fluids or transfusion, did a fast scan, and he was fast positive, so he was leaking into his belly. So we took him to theatre, opened him up, and he had a bunch of gunshot holes in his, bullet holes in his small intestine. So he had about 10 bullet holes. And what had happened is the bullet had gone in, threaded its way through his pelvis, shredded his small intestine, and we pulled it out of the underside of his diaphragm over on the left. And it's just a good illustration of once a high-velocity missile goes into a body, it can pretty much go anywhere. And going back to that video, that's where my concern was with that bloke on the helicopter, was that bullet might have ended up in his gut. And so we were able to do things like scrub in. That's me on the right there assisting with that surgery. And so we resected all that gut that had holes in it and put him all back together. We did primary anastomosis there. And he was a local national guy, and they were often full of intestinal worms. So we wormed him while we were at it. And that was one of the biggest pieces of intestinal worm there. I look happy that I was trying to keep it as a pet. They wouldn't let me. But it was very, very, very interesting stuff. This was another high-velocity gunshot wound where this guy, he was actually an enemy fighter. So we'd been out on a job with US Special Operations, and they'd shot this guy from about 100 metres with a high-velocity rifle that they were using. And so to orient you, that's his right buttock. So that's his right elbow in the left-hand side of the slide. And you can see that the entrance wound from the bullet there is quite small. But what you see is that massive bruising going all the way up his buttock and into his back. And when a high-velocity missile hits a target, it slows down rapidly, and all that energy has to go somewhere, and it causes a thing called temporary cavitation, a massive pressure wave that emanates out from the tract of the bullet that just pulverises tissue. And when we got to this guy, so we responded to him, the Geneva Convention says that once an enemy is incapacitated, you treat them like you would one of your own. And so this was another unique situation that we found ourselves in. This is a guy who was trying to kill us seconds before we were trying to save his life, and that was just part of the role. And so when we got to him, this was his exit wound in his lateral thigh. And so it was this incredible exit wound there. And at first we thought that he must have had something explosive in his pocket that had detonated. We just couldn't really make sense of that. But the femoral artery was intact, strong peripheral pulse. We packed it with a thing called a hemostatic, which this was an older generation. This was 2009, this one happened, and wrapped him all up. And that's when we unwrapped him at the forward surgical team. But you can see all that devitalised tissue, all that black tissue from that pressure wave, just killing off all the tissue there. But when we did his x-ray, it made sense why he had such a massive exit wound. So the bullet had hit his proximal femur, shattered it, and dissipated all that energy and blown out that lateral thigh. And so with this guy, I'd managed him in the field. We'd managed him in flight back to the forward surgical team, did his resus. intubated him, so went back, did the anaesthetic and tubed him, and then scrubbed in for theatre. So it was this sort of really unique situation where you could do all of that, this full spectrum. I didn't shoot him. That would have been a clean sweep of the board if I had it. But we took him into theatre and put an external fixator on him and then cut away all that dead tissue. So the initial wound surgery was all about cutting away all the devitalised stuff, leaving the wound bed open, and then stabilising the injury with external fixation. And so that was him all packaged up. And he then went into well, basically, because he was an enemy combatant, he went into the US intelligence, Central Intelligence, took him and looked. So it was this strange sort of paradox where you had these enemy fighters that you had to use your best medical skill sets to try and deal with. This bloke's a good mate of mine to this day, and that's an exit wound on the left side of his neck. So he got shot by an AK-47. He was one of our snipers, and he was sitting up in an overwatch position. Snipers like to get up high on hills and shoot down on things. And he was up on a hill while we were doing a job in a village, and an enemy fighter managed to get out of the village and sneak up on his hill and shoot him from about 200 metres. And so the entrance wound was about the midline at about the same level on his neck there, and then it blew out his neck. Snipers hang out in pairs, so there's a sniper and a spotter. And so this poor spotter was trying to get some pressure on this wound, and the bullet just tracked. It didn't go through his spinal cord, thank goodness, but you can see the path of the bullet there, little pockets of air that the bullet sucked into the tissues, and it's taken the back off the spinous process as it's gone through. But that same pressure wave that I was talking about, that temporary cavitation, stunned his spinal cord at that level and sent him into neurogenic shock. So this bloke was fundamentally quadriplegic. He was alert, oriented, but he couldn't move, and this enemy fighter was still shooting him up, and so his spotter was trying to put pressure on this and fire back, and this poor bloke couldn't do anything about it but was awake for it. And then this is the image with the contrast in, and you can see that bullet's pretty much passed straight through some of the big pipes there without disrupting them. So by my calculations, that's an internal jugular and an internal carotid, and neither of them got pranged. He was very lucky and made a very good recovery. Sadly, there was a bunch of kids that get caught up in these sort of insurgencies, and this is a little fellow who'd found an improvised explosive device and was playing with it when it initiated and blew most of his fingers off and both his eyes out. So there was a lot of this sort of stuff that was pretty heartbreaking. This little guy got shot through the arm and the hip and sustained a fair bit of nerve damage. And this fellow was in a IED strike in a car. He had an open skull injury, open abdomen, had lost most of a hand and a foot. And so this was the sort of thing that we were seeing just day in, day out, and kids getting drawn into it, and then a bunch of fatalities. And so, death was a pretty common thing over there. This was a human intelligence guy that worked for us who got caught and assassinated. This was one of 6 on that day, IED blast victims that came through our facility in various states of dismemberment. And so this was the role. And as I said before, when I was in that bubble, this didn't strike me as abnormal, and I didn't feel like I was having any trauma that was accumulating at the time. And it was only with hindsight that I look back and think, hey, this is abnormal. And as I said before also, I think everyone in the room is experiencing this cumulative trauma. And it's like, if anyone's heard that frog in the boiling water type analogy, when you're within it, you don't really see, you don't have any perspective, you don't have any reference point of what normal is, and so you just go along with it and keep building up this stress and this trauma, and no matter what role you're in medicine, it's there, whether you're dealing with it directly or whether it's vicarious trauma, just dealing with damaged people. It's these constant trauma inputs that you need to become aware of and then do something about to manage that, to be resilient against. And then the thing that's really hit home were the mates of mine that I responded to that I couldn't save. And so this was the guy I spoke of earlier, shot through the neck. Another mate of mine, actually within 10 minutes of that sniper getting shot through the neck, this other mate of mine was shot through the head, and unfortunately we couldn't do much for him. This friend of mine stood on an improvised explosive device and lost both his legs and an arm, and we worked on him for about 40 minutes before we lost him. And this another friend of mine was shot through the chest, and I was involved in his failed resuscitation. We lost him. These are the 4 of my mates that I was involved with, and then sadly there was many. I've lost count, over a dozen of other friends that I lost along the way. And so it was all this kind of cumulative stress, but yet throughout it all, I had a couple of ups and downs, particularly after that IED strike, but I was able to remain functional and kept going back, kept doing the job. And when I was in that environment, I was very resilient. And then it was only when I got out of the army that it sort of all started to catch up with me a little bit. And so with hindsight, what was happening was, even though there was a stack of stress, on the other side of the scales, there was a stack of resilience, all these factors that I'll talk to that allowed us to remain resilient within an organisation like the SAS, balanced out that stress and resilience. And so if you look at it on the scales, you go along fine. And I suspect most in the room are probably, you know, got a bunch of stress in their life, but are very innately and inherently, by virtue of the fact that you've gotten yourself through medical degrees and you're high-functioning doctors, have got a bunch of resilience, but you're balancing that against a bunch of stress. And that works well until you take a dip in resilience and the stress can catch up with you. And so if we look at this from the perspective of Maslow's hierarchy, I was pretty much, what he referred self-actualised. So I felt that I was kind of the best version of myself as a doctor with the SAS regiment. And so I had all that stuff down the bottom, all those basic needs, all the food, water, warmth, rest, safety. Safety was a bit dubious sometimes, but for the most part, I had professional security and belongingness, love needs. I had my family, so a young family at home while I was doing all of this, which was that part. But my real close interactions and my close social network was my workmates. So these people were like family, you know, you'd quite literally risk your life to try and save one of them, and you knew that feeling was mutual. So I had those really strong bonds at work. From an esteem perspective, prestige, feeling of accomplishment, being part of an organisation like the SAS Regiment had all that attached to it. And within that, I felt that I was functioning at a good level. I was doing my job well. I was internally validated, and I was being externally validated as well. And so I was self-actualised. But the trap that I'd fallen into is most of this was tethered to my role as a doctor within the SAS. That was what I was self-actualised as, not as a human being outside of work. And so I was suffering from a thing called Contingent Self-Esteem. And so this was taken on the day where I was presented with a medal called the Commendation for Distinguished Service. And it was a great event. It was at Government House in Western Australia, and they dust off a dignitary to come and present it to you. The family's there. We dress up in a monkey suit. For anyone who follows military at all, that's a bloke by the name of Mark Donaldson, who won the Victoria Cross for Australia. So he's in military circles a big deal, and I'm lucky enough to call him a mate. And so Dono turned up for this ceremony, and I look at this as being my self-esteem was great. I was, like I said, self-actualised, feeling really good about myself, but it was all contingent on me wearing that uniform. And what I failed to realise is that most of the prestige belonged to the job and not to me. And I think across the board as doctors, we can tend to fall into that trap. It's something where, and any job where you're highly invested, I'm lucky enough to have a bit to do with professional sporting teams, and so people that are at the top of their game professionally, and this is a point that I really drill home to them, that, you know, enjoy it while you're in that uniform, but make sure you know who you are when you take that uniform off. And it's hard to function at the top of your game if you're not very invested in your role. And like I said, every doctor in this room is obviously hugely invested in their roles. You wouldn't be here in this profession if you weren't. But you also need to know who you are outside of medicine, because otherwise things can get a bit problematic when you go to discharge. And so this is what happened when I went to discharge. I was self-actualised. I had not seen this coming. I really hadn't. All I'd seen was that I'd get out, I'd be home more. I got out shortly after our third son was born, and my wife said, hey, you know, that's enough. You've got to stop doing this. And it was time. And all I saw was I'd be home a bunch more to help out with the family. I'd be earning a bunch more money. The army doesn't pay great. You know, you don't do it for the cash, but I doubled my wage when I took a civilian medical officer job, and I'd be safe. You know, no one would be shooting at me. Everything looked positive, but what I failed to realise is that what I was going to lose was that whole top half of my Maslow's hierarchy, if you like. So everything up there was related to my role, and I hadn't invested in much. Thankfully, I'd invested enough in my family that family unit didn't break down, but I didn't have anything else really outside of being a doctor in the army, and I really fell in a heap. And it was at that point that all those factors factors that were bolstering my resilience fell away, all that cumulative trauma was still there, and that stress, these things that I hadn't processed or felt that I needed to process, and so my scales toppled. And it was as I kind of started to work my way through that, I was starting to get all these symptoms of post-traumatic stress. There was no two ways about it. I had all the hallmarks, the bad dreams, the intrusive thoughts, sweaty palms, racing heart, all this sort of stuff that I knew as a doctor, hey, that's post-traumatic stress. It just seemed weird that it was happening at a time where I'd never been safer. So things were safer than ever for me. I was no longer at any threat. And this was catching up with me. And I started to, as I was working through that, I was kind of living it as a person, but then analysing it as a doctor, saying, well, hey, this, and starting to look at the literature around psychology, looking at the physiology of what's happening in all this stress response, what this thing that we call resilience is, and starting to try and pick it apart so that I could basically rebuild myself outside of the army I knew that I'd done it once and become quite resilient, and trying to work that out, that I started to look into the constructive resilience and what it was actually made up of, and that led to this Resilience Shield project, which has turned into a book that's due for release in late July. But this was the fallout as I went along and had a look at what resilience was all about, how I could rebuild it. I started to realise that stress and resilience are universal. It doesn't matter if your stress is the stress of being with the SAS regiment, or the stress of being a busy GP trying to churn through 6-minute consults, or the stress of being an emergency doctor or nurse or paramedic or police officer, or a mum at home raising young kids. Stress is stress, resilience is resilience. So the same principles are universal across the board. And as I started to go along, I started to team up a bit with my brother, who had done his career in the SAS and popped out the other end, and another ex-SAS guy, and we've co-written this book. But we've built this model of resilience, and so when I looked at the literature, it started to fit pretty neatly into these layers, all these things that we know are causative or at least correlative of resilience. And so we mapped it into these layers: innate, mind, body, social, professional, and then this adaptation at the end there. And I just want to touch on the wave tops of all of these as we go along here. Just a few bits and pieces that I found quite interesting and hopefully might resonate with some in the audience about building that resilience. But then also on the other side of those scales, you've got your stresses and this thing called perceptual stress. So there's the actual stress, and then there's everything that we amplify it within our minds. So our minds are great tools. They can do wonderful things, but they can also create a lot of havoc. And so there's room to move on both sides of that stress resilience scales by reducing particularly this perceptual stress, how we react to stressors in our life, and then building the resilience on the other side to stack everything in the favour of resilience. And this is a great quote, I think, by a famous Stoic Epictetus: men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of things. So a lot of our stress in our life is self-generated, and having insight into that and some strategies to deal with it goes a long way. And so what you end up with is now this ability, and what I sort of started to work out is, here are some tangibles that I can start to tip those scales back in the favour of resilience. I can start to work on these different layers, if you like, of the resilience shield, and start to try and reduce the stressors. The innate layer is an interesting one. When you go into the literature on the innate genetics behind, we know there's genetic markers that correlate with resilience. A lot of them are retrospective trials where they look at people involved in things like the September 11 attacks or natural disasters, and they look at who's done well, who hasn't done so well, and look at their biomarkers, look at their genetics. And so we know that there's genes that are positively correlated. Hard to prove causality. I think it'd be hard to get the ethics to do that study and take a group and then put them through trauma. But we do know that there's an innate layer and certainly there's a genetic, but also an epigenetic. So how we're brought up, what stressors we've had at what key stages in our life play into this, and how we've dealt with those stressors. For most part, innate layer we think of as being set in stone, but there are a few things there. I think most people would think that their personality is quite set in concrete. The reality is it's not. There's some interesting studies there that say only about 40% of our personality is hardwired, and we can change the remainder. And also the other thing is when you look at events in the past, and this was something that I did a little bit of work with psychologists over the years, is looking at events and just reframing them and having this cognitive reappraisal. And one good example there is that mate of mine who trod on a device, lost 2 legs and an arm, and we worked on him for quite some time and lost him. On that same day, I'd spent years just looking back, seeing as the day when I couldn't save Brett, and that was how I held on to that. That was how I framed that memory, and that really stuck with me for years. But when I looked at that through a different lens, and it was on that same day we'd had one guy shot, we'd had another guy hit with a rocket-propelled grenade, we'd had two guys that had shrapnel injuries from a hand grenade. The same blast that Brett initiated also badly damaged another bloke and damaged another two guys of his patrol. We were able to stabilise them and evacuate them. And so as I sort of looked back on that and cognitively reappraised it, I started to see, well, hang on a sec, yeah, it was terrible that Brett didn't make it through that day, but there was all these positives. And so that's, when we look at our innate resilience, there is a role for reframing the way we look back at events in a more positive light, and that's this cognitive reappraisal. So your memories can actually be altered there in a more positive fashion. I mean, any of this stuff is, of course, best done with professional help, but if you've got these traumas in the past that you're a little bit hung up on, it's well worth having a look at whether you can cognitively reappraise that. The mind layer, when we look at the Resilience Shield, and as part of all of this, we've got a government research grant. So we've employed a PhD psychologist who did a PhD in resilience. We've put together a survey, and we're validating this Resilience Shield model. We want to know scientifically whether this thing checks out. We know the literature says all of these things cause resilience or correlate to resilience, but we want to know, as a shield, does it come together to equal resilience, and what parts of it are most important. And this is in recognition of the fact that everyone's busy, and so if you have to drill down into how you can spend 15, 20, 30 minutes of a day towards optimising your resilience, this is starting to give us the answers. And what we've had about 2,000 people complete that survey, and we've got a website, resilientshield.com, where you can do the survey if you're interested. It'll give you a feedback on how your Resilience Shield is structured and balanced, and where your strengths and relative weaknesses are. But what the overwhelming evidence coming back from the initial survey data is that the mind layer is exponentially more important than any other layer. So if you have to focus on one area, then working on the mind as opposed to the body or your social, professional adaptation, the mind's the critical one. And the big key thing is some form of meditation practice or a mindfulness meditation practice. I know there's a lot of talk of it. I was slow to take this up. The SAS had a thing called the High Performance Initiative from about the early 2000s. I didn't really buy into it. I only came to mindfulness meditation sort of after the fact, when all my maladaptive coping strategies weren't working, and I came to it, and it's an absolute game changer. And I know there's a lot of talk around mindfulness programs in medicine, in workplaces, but I can't recommend them enough. And we're starting to get the evidence as well that's pretty compelling. So it's a form of training like any other. The benefits are proportionate to the effort, but you can get quick gains with minimal sessions. So there's this growing body of statistical literature showing that you can make meaningful changes with very small meditation interventions. So in the order of 10 minutes a day, 3 or 4 times a week, we can now look at the functional MRI studies of people responding to trauma inputs or responding to painful stimuli and see a tangible change. It's not just sort of it is in people's brains, but it's not just a placebo effect, if you like. A great starting point for anyone who's interested. There's a bunch of guided meditation apps, but I got started with a thing called Calm. You just download it. It's got a 10-minute daily guided meditation, and it was an absolute game changer for me back when I was sort of struggling through that transition. It changed me within weeks for the positive. And basically what we're looking to influence here is our stress response system. And a lot of those genetic markers I spoke of earlier that are correlated to resilience are to do with your HPA axis, so your stress response axis, and how your amygdala responds to stimuli in terms of your fight or flight response. And what we're doing with any meditative practice is we're strengthening the bonds between the prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain, and the amygdala, the reptilian brain, in a nutshell. There's sort of other bits and pieces to it, but we know that long-term meditators will strengthen those networks. They'll shrink down their amygdala, they'll reduce their stress response to a traumatic stimulus, they'll minimise the duration of an amygdala response after a traumatic stimulus. And so this we know overwhelmingly is something that we should all be doing in the realm of medicine. This is why it's been rolled into Army Special Operations. There's some great literature now coming out of policing in the US saying that groups that go into meditation have less inappropriate use of force incidents, less less workplace accidents. And so this is how you can sort of try and start to sell it to this warrior culture, which is where I find myself a lot. This actually makes you a more effective operator, and it certainly doesn't make you passive. You can still use that fight or flight mechanism and aggression when you need to. It just means you have conscious control over it and you're doing it deliberately. You're not letting that reptile sort of fire off for you. And I sort of look at it as the prefrontal cortex is like your safety switch, and then your amygdala is like your trigger, and you want to be able to just make sure you're controlling that safety switch. But we, like I said, we know overwhelmingly this works. There's a couple of great tools that I use to meditate. There's these neurofeedback devices. That's me meditating in an ice bath. I do that. My wife just shakes her head at me these days. Not much that I do surprises her these days, but don't start with that. That's not a good place to start. But these neurofeedback devices are excellent. They're like a mini EEG, and so they map your brain waves in your prefrontal cortex, and they give you real-time feedback through an app. So you'll play an app, it'll have some background music that either gets louder or quieter depending on the activity of the brain waves in your prefrontal cortex. And when you hit meditative brain waves, it gives you immediate feedback. So it gives you little birds chirping in this instance. That thing's called a Muse device. And then at the end, you get that feedback there, so that graph. So for that particular meditation, I was in a meditative brainwave state for 8 minutes, 30 seconds, neutral for 6 minutes, active for 9 seconds. And what you can do is just correlate real time your breathing patterns or your posture, what you're doing at any given time with what achieves a meditative brainwave state. So it's just a way of, otherwise you're sort of sitting there for 10 minutes and you kind of come to and think, oh, did that work? What was going on? And this gives you that real time feedback for people who appreciate that. And then this is another interesting thing I tend to use as well. I mean, I'm not trying to push any of these products, but just making you aware that these are out there. This is a system called NewCalm, and I got onto this by some US Special Operations crew that I used to work with, and they've embraced it. The FBI uses this. There's about 50 American sporting teams that use this as a recovery device, and it works through this thing called neuroacoustics, and which is underpinned by a thing called binaural beats. And so it's pumping different frequencies into each ear, and then it's got these layered sounds on top of it. And what that does is it activates neural networks that are trying to correlate these two different frequencies, and it sort of forces your brain into these meditative states, so it almost bullies your brain waves into meditation. So this is a great tool. And then it uses this electromagnetic disc, which sits on I'm a little less sold on the science behind the disc, to be honest, but I still wear it. But it sits on a meridian that stimulates your vagus nerve, apparently. But the science behind the neuroacoustics and the binaural beats is there, and it's quite strong, and it's very interesting. And I find this device very good. And it's a passive thing, so you can sit there and just have this happen to you rather than trying to actively learn to meditate. So I think there's a role for both. I use this on planes. I used it actually today on the flight over. Another interesting thing is that we know that meditation reduces pain perception, and so without going into the nth degree of the detail, you can look it up if you like, but these are just some functional MRI studies of meditators and non-meditators under noxious stimuli. And what meditation does is, when you think of what pain is, there's a stimulus going in, it's ripping up your nervous system into your brain, you then have that interpreted as pain, and then you respond to that. So you will have an emotive and effective reaction. And what the whole premise of a lot of mindfulness meditation is non-judgment, so not judging it. And so what they show is these studies that down the middle there, you still get that painful stimulus resonating in the areas of the brain and registering, but then you get these other activations around it that kind of override that. They sort of, rather than saying, oh, this is terrible, I'm in pain, it's just like, oh yeah, we've got pain. And it reduces this painful response. So it's still the same stimulus, but it reduces your pain perception and increases your pain threshold. It's a really interesting thing, and one that I think I've got huge benefit from over the years with my niggles in terms of reducing chronic pain, and one that's good to know about for yourselves. but also your patience. Like this stuff works. There's a bunch of studies around it. And this particular study, looking at the meditation group, that was after 4 20-minute meditation sessions. So this isn't years and years sitting on a hill humming and meditating. This is just short, sharp interventions. You can have these really meaningful pain stimulus overrides. Gratitude's a big one. This was a helicopter that I was in Afghanistan, 2011, that fell out of the sky. They don't call that a crash, they call that a hard landing. I think there's more paperwork if you admit to crashing a helicopter, but odd thing to be grateful for, but I am that I was in this one, and we were all pretty banged up. We were all thrown around. There was a couple of busted bones, dislocated joints, but I certainly have had a lot of mates over the years that have been in helicopter crashes, and a number of which who've died, others that have lost limbs or had really bad spinal injuries. So I'm very grateful that I was in this helicopter that had a hard landing and not a crash. And since that day, I've had a bit of back pain, which niggled and niggled for years, bunch of sciatica, as every good bloke does. You ignore it and train through it. But I eventually went off and had the scan, and I don't think you need to be a neurosurgeon to spot the pathology there, but a disc there probably got a bit squished in that hard landing and pushes a bit on my spinal cord. And the thing here is that this just talks about the concept of mental framing. We get the choice of how we react to these sort of things. And this is another great quote from Marcus Aurelius, who's a very famous Stoic. So, reject your sense of injury and the injury itself disappears. And I think that the premise of that is very true. I mean, we get to choose how we respond to this. And I frame this, and to be honest with you, when I came out of the MRI scanner and all it was a badly bulged disc, I was stoked. I was really thankful. Actually, I said, oh, that's great, or something like that to the MRI guy. He said, oh, you've got a really badly bulged disc. I'm like, oh, that's awesome. He's like, well, that's a bit weird. He didn't expect that response. But the reason being, optimism is hugely correlated with resilience. And this is a mate of mine who had come to me. I was his doctor. He was a special operator, had come to me with very similar pain to what I was experienced. He described it to me. We assumed it was going to be a bulged disc and sciatica. It turned out to be a spinal tumour. That just there was nothing that could be done about it, and he was dead within about 6 months of coming to see me. So I mean, I can frame this as, oh, this is terrible, I've got this bulged disc, I get sciatica and all of that, or I can frame it as it's just a bulged disc, and it wasn't in this instance. These are another couple of mates of mine. So this is a bloke called Damian Tomlinson, and if you look closely there, he's got 2 carbon fibre legs, and so he lost his legs in an IED strike in Afghanistan. And he is one of the most grateful and optimistic blokes I know, just a brilliant human being. And I suspect he'd give anything to be able to feel the pain that I feel in his legs. He hasn't got legs. Another friend of mine who unfortunately was rendered quadriplegic in an incident in Afghanistan. And I was actually there on the night when that happened, and was there when we did the X-ray of his cervical spine. He's 23 years old at the time and had a massive spinal fracture there, burst fracture with a big retropulsed fragment. So I mean, he's got legs, but he can't feel them. He drives a wheelchair with his thumb. So I mean, being grateful for what we've got. It's easy to lose perspective in a modern day world, in a first world environment, a middle class environment, but just taking that step back and thinking, hey, you know what, life's good. And this really provides my perspective. I'm very thankful. The body layer. So I don't think it'll come any surprise that exercise is hugely correlated with resilience. Are there any Olympic lifters in the room by any chance? Anyone throw some weights around? This is something I've started to do. There's a video of me trying to learn to Olympic lift. I got there in the end. But I mean, it's whatever your exercise, the literature there shows that the gains you make in resilience from exercise are exponential at the start, and then you get this sort of petering off. But little bits do make a huge difference. There's some really interesting studies in reduced all-cause morbidity and mortality from really minimal exercise interventions, and we talk to that in the book, but this is me trying to learn to Olympic lift. These aren't big weights, just for perspective. This is 5 kilos on each side. And then I thought I'd better chuck one in where I actually do lift the thing to save face. pop your hemorrhoids back in and get on with your day. And it's, I mean, no matter what this works well for me. I mean, with little kids, this is something I can do in my shed. I can go out there and have a 30-minute session. But even short, sharp sessions, there's some great evidence to suggest have huge benefits. And so getting some exercise in is a fantastic way to build resilience. Sleep optimization is huge and something that I think is done very poorly across the board, but particularly in the medical profession. Does anyone track their sleep? Are there any people that use a sleep tracker? Someone sort of kind of. This is a superpower. Once you start to say sleep deprivation is akin to alcohol intoxication, there's some fascinating studies around that. There's one that we talk to in the book that looks at surgeons performing some complex surgical tasks when they've got a blood alcohol of 0.05, so illegal to drive, versus when they've had 3 hours of sleep deprivation the night prior, so 3 hours less, and they performed better when they had the blood alcohol level than the sleep deprivation. And I mean, the medical community is one that runs on minimal sleep, often where day-night cycles, your sleep gets interrupted, and so we might as well be rolling around the place slightly drunk, is the reality of it. In terms of our function, the take-home points here, tracking sleep is a great place to start. And once again, when we looked at the data coming back from this resilience survey for the body layer, it was sleep that was head and shoulders above everything else correlated to resilience, above exercise, above diet, above BMI, above all the other factors. Sleep was the one that really made a difference. Tracking your sleep, so there's a stack of sleep trackers, Fitbits, smartwatches. I wear this thing is called an Aura ring, and it tracks your sleep and resting heart rate variability, bunch of things. So relatively cheap and easy. Blue light is another thing that's worth being aware of, and so blue light gets emitted from all our devices, and that's the relevance of it here. Back in the day when we were sort of in caves and what have you, we worked on a circadian rhythm where as it got dark, you know, the dark stimulus came in, hit your pineal gland, brain released melatonin, cortisol started to dip off, allowed you to get sleepy and have a good night's rest. And then as the sun came back up again, you got light in, that switched off the melatonin production, cortisol spiked, and you'd feel alert and you'd go about your day. The problem that we have these days is that all our devices emit blue light, and particularly late at night when you really need that melatonin to be coming up, if you're staring at a screen, a device, a tablet, a TV, a computer, that's switching off all this melatonin release, and it's stopping you from having that really deep sleep and getting to sleep easier, but also getting into those deep states of rejuvenating sleep, the REM sleep. And so just a simple set of blue light blocking glasses, so 30 odd bucks from Officeworks, and they're non-magnified, they're just clear glasses. They'll block the blue light, allow that melatonin release, and so that's something that I use if I need to be staring at a screen. Ideally you're not, but if you have to be, block that blue light. A lot of devices have got functions where you can block blue light on it if you look in your settings, or just wear the blue light blocking glasses. Alcohol's a bit of a killer in terms of your sleep patterns. I'll show you some graphs in just a sec, and caffeine does much the same. But so I mean, comes from my sleep tracker, and so basically as you go through a period of sleep, you'll have different stages of deep sleep, light sleep, but the stuff you want's the REM sleep. That's the really rejuvenating stuff, and that's the stuff up the top there, the light blue blocks. The significance of that's a normal night's sleep where I've got some good blocks of REM, and you should have about 25% of your night's sleep as REM, and you'll be rejuvenated. That's when all your big drops in cortisol happen, where your growth hormone gets released, hormones like testosterone. Most of that recovery happens in REM. The REM increases as your period of sleep goes on, so most of it will be in the back half of your period of sleep. This is a night where I just had a couple of drinks, and I mean a couple, only 2 or 3 standard drinks, and you'll notice in the back half of that night there, instead of going into blocks of REM, I'm having these periods where I'm just waking up. So I'm coming out of sleep, waking up, coming out of sleep. And what happens with alcohol is it's a great maladaptive coping strategy. It'll sort of numb us. It's one that gets used widely in society, and it helps you get to sleep. It reduces what's called sleep latency. So I think we would all have that experience where you've had a few drinks and you can nod off to sleep really well. That's because it stimulates the release of GABA, which is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. So it allows you to get into a state of sleep pretty quickly. So there I've nodded off pretty quickly and got a couple of blocks of deep sleep, 1 block of REM. But as the alcohol washes out of your system and the GABA starts to wash out of your system, your brain starts to release glutamate, which is your main excitatory neurotransmitter. And that's why, I don't know if people have experienced this, I certainly have, where you can wake up at 2 a.m. after having had a few drinks and your brain's going a million miles an hour. And even if you're not waking up on a sleep level, it's preventing you from going into REM sleep. So even if you're not aware of being awake, then you'll wake up in the morning feeling a bit sluggish because you haven't had that rejuvenating sleep. And like I said, that's not a big night, that's just a couple of glasses of wine with dinner. So it's worth trying where you can to knock that alcohol out of your routine just to get that better night's sleep. Caffeine will do the same thing through the adenosine receptors. So if you can try and reduce your caffeine intake and have it earlier in the day, because it's got a 3 to 5 hour half-life. So if you get a massive loading dose and don't finish till 5 p.m, then that's all there stopping your sleep. Social layer. So socially we know that, and it makes sense, if you've got good social support, then you're going to be more resilient. If you've got a good team around you. And when we talk to the social layer in the Resilience Shield, we're talking about not your work teams. I mean, these teams are important, and that was a big part of why we were so resilient within the SAS regiment. I'm down the bottom left if anyone's playing Spot Dan. Where's Wally? But it's these teams that are more important. So this is my little team of ungrateful kids and long-suffering wife. God bless them. But I mean, this is the stuff. And I mean, it's easy, and when you're very busy professionally, to have your family sort of play second fiddle, but you need to keep that perspective on work. I know that everyone in the medical profession is very invested in their work, and you need to be, but try and keep that perspective and try and find that balance where you can. The job is not going to love you back, is the reality. And that's the harsh reality. Most jobs will chew you up, spit you out, and get you a new one. And the human toll is often on your family. Transitions are worth thinking about. So this plays into the mind layer, but it's very important to the social layer. And what I mean by this is just having these active transitions, particularly between work and home, where you make a psychological transition to leave your work day behind and enter your house or whatever it is you're coming home to, as the best version of yourself that you can. Try not to drag that work home. Try to be able to physically force yourself to stop and think, right, okay, that'll still be there for me tomorrow if there's stress or there's things that you're going to have to deal with. But right now, I'm going to walk in this door and be the best version of, for me, for the most part, my kids are pretty happy to see me. Some days my wife's happy to see me, and so I don't want to drag anything from work into that, because it can have that flow on, and if you've still take that negative energy with you, then that feeds on to your social interactions. And if you can build exercise into that transition from work to home, even better, even if it's only a small amount, but just have some punctuation between your work and your family life, and even between interactions at work. And this was something I used to do a lot in my role with the prison system. Just try and think about what's the best version of myself that I need to bring to this next interaction. But from a social perspective, just trying to make sure that you're not bringing your work home. Easier said than done, but thinking about it is the first step. Invest in your family and friends. Listen to your loved ones. So this was something that I didn't do well. My wife could certainly see that I was burning out years before I could see it in the military. She had perspective that I didn't have, and I think this one was also key for me. Don't expect them to understand your work. And so we didn't tell our partners much about our military work. There was a lot of operational security around it, and I didn't want her to worry any more than she needed to. But when I did start to open up a little bit, something that struck me was she just didn't seem to get it. And it took me a while to realise that it's not that she didn't want to, it's just she couldn't possibly. Just like everyone in this room in medicine is going to have unique experiences that only people in their fraternity will really understand. And that's great, that's what bonds us to our professional social circle. But just understand that your loved ones aren't going to get it, and don't expect them to. And it's not that they don't want to, they just can't, because they haven't shared those experiences. Professionally, so this is where we can really build resilience to specific stressors of the role, and one of the key ways we did this in special operations was through reality-based training. So the old train as you're going to fight, and so this video was we did a lot of this, basically high fidelity training. We're just firing simulation rounds, paint rounds there. But this is the sort of, when we weren't out doing the job, we'd be training for the job. But the key things are to try and generate as much realism and relevance as you can and induce stress. This is a stress inoculation, so we'd do it over and over. That's me there putting the tourniquet on, which is another relevant point. Get involved in the training. Put yourself out there, be vulnerable, get involved in the training, learn from it. Or if you're in a position where you can organise training, make sure you're doing that for your subordinates, because the more you train, the more you can shrink down that. We spoke about that perceptual stress, that stress that surrounds an acute stressor. The more you train, and we trained endlessly for this scenario so that when we did have gunshot wound or blast wound victims in the field, it just wasn't that stressful for us. And to be honest, I remember thinking after the first significant combat trauma that I dealt with, I remember being underwhelmed by it, to be honest, because we'd trained so intensively that the stress of the real situation was just sort of almost non-existent. It was almost on autopilot, and that can really shrink down that perceptual stress. And so get in there and train yourself, stay current, it does involve being vulnerable. There's a great quote by a bloke called Eckhart Tolle. He's a spiritualist, I think he calls himself, but he talks a lot about ego, and he says that ego and enthusiasm can't coexist. So either you're egotistical or you're enthusiastic. Be enthusiastic, get in there, get involved, train, fail in training and fix yourself up. If you're in a position to organise training for junior doctors, then get in there and do it, because as much of that stress inoculation as you can get really reduces that perceptual stress and helps you to tip that stress resilience scale. When it comes to realism and relevance, relevance is far more important. So it doesn't need to be super expensive, super high fidelity days of training with some fancy sim man. We killed our sim man pretty quickly after getting him. That's him down the bottom there. So he didn't work at all. He was held together with gaffer tape. But we still got some really useful training out of that mannequin, and there it's in the back of a helicopter, it's got needles in it, someone's doing a chest tube, because they could see the relevance. We could get these great training outcomes with this busted mannequin that didn't hook up to anything. Up the top right there, we're training with some tactical police, and we've got Resus Annie there. But once again, we got great training outcomes because they could see the relevance. Doesn't need to be super high fidelity or realistic. Top left, we were doing some cold weather stuff, and we actually did go to the snow, and that was great. So if you can get realism and relevance, fantastic, but if you have to choose between the two, go for relevance. After action reviews, this is something the military did really, really well, and I'd encourage everyone to do after events, particularly critical events, or good or bad, is just as soon as possible after the event, pull your team together and do a debrief. But the key things here, and once again, this is what particularly special operations did really well. After every operation, we'd have an AAR, and it was the key things to make them work well is they need to be non-judgmental, they need to be rankless. There's no one person dictating down to the others. Everyone needs to have their say, and what you're aiming to do is just get this rounded, accurate interpretation of what happened. Look at the facts where you can. What went well, and they're your positives that need to be reinforced. What didn't go so well, and they're your negatives that need to be trained up or improved, and then put something in place to train up and improve those negatives. And so we would do this constantly. We'd be out on operations, we'd do our thing, something went really well, we're like, that's a sustain, let's keep training for that, we'll reinforce that. Something didn't go as well, we're like, we need to fix this. And it doesn't need to be a critical incident, it can just be something that didn't go as well as we planned. And so we say, right, was this a weapon failure? Was this a insertion failure? Why did this go wrong? Do we need different kit? Do we need different techniques? Does this person need more training? These sort of things. And that then empowers people to have some strategies to improve themselves and be able to become more resilient to that stress the next time. Otherwise, if you just sort of move past it and let it fester or try and come back to it at a later date, people's memories change. You'll have chances to really sort of reinforce any negative outcomes, and that has impacts on people's mental health. So try and grab it early, do it in a non-judgmental fashion. It's not about chucking someone under the bus. It's about looking at why things happened and what was good and what was bad and improving it. And then the adaptation layer, so we sort of put this around the outside of the resilience shield. This is basically talking about having resilience to novel stressors. This is how you can become confident in approaching something that you've never seen before. So we live in a complex world. We do have these novel stressors, and the case study we used in the book that introduces this. We use a vignette from Richard Harris's experience, and if people haven't read his book, Against All Odds, I really strongly encourage you to do so. So him and Craig Challen, who's the other diver there on the right of that picture, Harry's on the left. These are the guys who basically spearheaded that Thai cave rescue, and it's a brilliant example of this adaptation, this resilience against a never before seen challenge. They had these bunch of kids stuck in this cave. They needed these. So Harry, a very competent cave diver, so he's resilient against the stressors of cave diving, very competent anaesthetist, so he's resilient there, you know, the stress of that is not much, but then he could pull them together with this adaptation, and the more you build all the other layers, the more of this adaptation, this ability to approach novel tasks with confidence, the more of that you get. Just really quickly, as we sort of start to wrap up, I wanted to talk to post-traumatic growth. And we hear a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder, but I think it's important to know that there is a flip side to post-traumatic stress, and that's post-traumatic growth. And so these are people who, because of their trauma, actually become better versions of themselves. And to be honest, I consider myself one of them, and I'll talk about the different aspects of that make up post-traumatic growth. But basically, if you have in this instance, a psychological trauma in this graph, you know, you can succumb to that long term, and that's post-traumatic stress disorder. It becomes this established negative pattern. You can have a partial recovery, but still not quite get back to your baseline. You can recover, some people call that resilience, or you can grow from it. You can actually be a better version of yourself. And like I was talking about before with the gratitude piece, I've had all these experiences where mates of mine have died. I haven't been able to save them. They haven't come home. I've watched some of their kids grow up without them. I've watched their wives go on without them. I've watched their mums and dads mourn them, and that's really had this profound impact on how I interact with my loved ones, how I live my life, and just really allowed me to sort of try and live my best life because these friends of mine can't. And so, I mean, these are the factors that we see in PTG, this increased appreciation of life, changed priorities, the stuff that I used to think was important, I now realise is minutiae, closer personal relationships, increased strength and resilience and personal strength. So that's that whole what doesn't kill us makes us stronger type thing, and then a spiritual development, sense of meaning. And the key is with any of this, and for yourselves and maybe your patients, it's doing something meaningful with your trauma. It's using it for something positive. And so you get a lot of people who've gone through domestic violence or maybe sexual assault, rape, and taking that and being able to use that very negative experience positively, so maybe to talk to other victims of those things. I've got a good friend in Adelaide who's a young man, was an infantry soldier with the army, and he was having headaches, and eventually they got too much and he went and got his head scanned, big brain cancer in there, and so his days are limited, his sort of lifespan's measured in years rather than decades. He's 24 years old, and he says that this is the best thing that's ever happened to him, which is a strange thing, you know, it's a young man with brain cancer, but he's experienced this post-traumatic growth construct as well, and he sort of talks about, you know, his blinkers are off, he's living his biggest life now because he knows it's finite. And so, you know, I just encourage everyone to be aware of PTG and to sort of, if you've got trauma of your own or if you've got patients with trauma and there's scope to be able to get them to make some sense and make some meaning out of that and use that trauma positively, they can actually, you know, a percentage of them become better versions of themselves. Awareness of new possibilities in life, which leads to this slide. I don't know if anyone in the room watches that SAS Australia show. I just actually came back from about 6 weeks in the Blue Mountains filming 2 series of that stuff, and these are the directing staff. And so it was basically, I put this slide up to just to remind us. I mean, this was something I left my prison health job for this. It was time for me to find a new challenge anyway, and this was the catalyst to leave. But I mean, it was a good challenge. It was something where I had to put myself out there, be vulnerable. I had to brush back up on all my pre-hospital stuff. But it was getting back out there. It was a new challenge. It would have been easy not to. It would have been much easier just to stay in my sort of safe little bubble in prison health, but as I said before, I'm trying to do the best I can to get the most out of this life, and I encourage everyone else too. And so I went off and had this experience for 6 weeks doing the med support for that show, and it was a great experience. And now I'm unemployed, so I need to find a job now. And anyone hiring? But no, just a reminder to get out there, you know, take chances, be vulnerable, live big. You only get one go at it, and try not to concern yourself too much with what other people think. I'm sure I'm going to cop a bit of flack if I end up on the telly for that. So Resilient Shield, so that's the book. It'll come out on the 27th of July, and I've just touched on the wave tops of all those layers there. I mean, the book goes right down into the granular detail of how you can build resilience and maintain it. The book presents resilience as this dynamic, modifiable construct that you can actually proactively build, and that's the idea, that's the premise, to try and build that resilience before the stress. Don't wait for the stress and build the resilience as a sort of intervention after the fact. Build your resilience, try and shrink down that stress that everyone has in their life, and try and sort of wind back that stress response system that's constantly firing. Coming full circle, this is the wound from that video at the start. So thankfully that was a through and through. I couldn't see the exit wound in the helicopter, but that's it down the thigh there near his pants. So it was a AK-47 round from about 200 metres, just went straight through him, didn't hit any bone or any major vessels in and out. You can see that once again, that temporary cavitation, so the bruising starting to come out. This is the day after, so he'd stayed on the helicopter, went and got it cleaned out. They chucked a surgical wick in it, which is that yellow thing there. And then the day following that, this is him back on the insertion helicopter. So it's me in the middle and him on the right there. He did miss a job. He missed the job that afternoon, but he was in surgery, so we let him get away with that. But hard as nails, he came on every other job following that. And this was him trying to have a nap a couple of weeks later. Look, thank you kindly for your attendance tonight. Thank you, Avant, for having me. It's a real privilege to have this opportunity, and I truly hope that there's something in there that's resonated and just stimulated a bit of thought. Do look after yourselves, look after your colleagues, be kind to yourself, and try and live your best life. Thanks, guys.